Morning, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a few minutes to get logged in, and then we will get started right at 10:30. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to start things off with a couple of announcements. First, we will be recording this session and sending it out to you later today. Second, we will be holding a Q&A at the end of the webinar. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to submit questions. We will hold them until the end and ask them in the order they were received. Finally, in an effort to support our local restaurants, we are holding a raffle at the end of this three-part series for two $50 DoorDash gift cards. Every webinar you attend within the series enters your name in the raffle. So if you attend all three, you will be entered 3 times. If you attend 2, you'll be entered twice, and so on. So be sure to join us next Thursday to get your name entered again. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand things over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Petra. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Blanquera, and I'm the Vice President of Client Success for the Columbus Collaboratory. On behalf of the Columbus Collaboratory and our partner Vernovus, we'd like to welcome you to the second of 3 sessions in our Cybersecurity eSeries. In last week's session, we covered the threat landscape and business continuity planning. In today's session, we'll be covering vulnerability management. Before we start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about ourselves and our speakers. The Columbus Collaboratory was founded by 7 of Ohio's largest corporations to provide trusted cybersecurity and artificial intelligence solutions to reduce costs and increase protection. Our cybersecurity capabilities include threat-centric vulnerability management managed services, security program compliance assessments, offensive exercises, and an active security community of security leaders for threat intelligence and best practice sharing. Let me tell you a little bit about our partners, Vernovus. Vernovus is a full-service staffing and solutions firm specializing in IT, cybersecurity, accounting, and finance. They have a growing business in technology and solutions practice focused in cybersecurity, business continuity, network and cloud architecture, as well as Active Directory and group policy management. From a cybersecurity standpoint, Vernovus's focus is in helping companies build, administer, and maintain strong cybersecurity programs. Let me take a moment to introduce our speakers. Troy Bendon is the Director of Security Innovation at the Columbus Collaboratory. He has more than 20 years experience in information security practice. Troy brings a wealth of experience and leadership to the Collaboratory, which began his 8-year active duty career with the Marine Network and Security Operations Center in Quantico, where Troy gained hands-on experience in security operations, as well as management and leadership development skills and experience. Following his active duty career, Troy held a number of progressively more senior IT security positions that included leading security and penetration testing teams, malware research, project management, and director of a global threat center. Since joining the Collaboratory to lead the Collaboratory's information sharing and analysis organization, Troy has provided tactical and strategic direction to our customers. His security software manufacturing experience continues to help inform insight and product direction for the benefit of our customers. Our second speaker for today is Kevin Jackson. He is a CISO of Vernovus. Hi, Kevin. Kevin is an executive information technologist, enterprise architect, and chief information security officer with 25+ years of experience serving in both commercial and DoD environments. An electrical engineer by degree, Kevin's area of expertise includes cybersecurity program management, DoD IT systems architecture and compliance management, pharmaceutical industry IT compliance management, wireless communication, and IT infrastructure management. During his time supporting the U.S. Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, he served as chief architect and DoD compliance manager for individual IT program investments valued from $50 to $300 million. Most recently, he served as executive director for cybersecurity and network infrastructure for a mid-sized family-owned pharmaceutical company with enterprise business size compliance requirements. Kevin is a part-time adjunct professor within the University of Cincinnati's IT department and the Villanova University College of Professional Studies, teaching online classes in cybersecurity and business intelligence data analytics. He has an MBA in IT management and is pursuing a PhD in information technology. Welcome all, and I'll turn this over to Troy.
Great, thanks, Ben. I appreciate everybody joining us today. If you were able to join us last week, today's is part 2 of a 3-part cybersecurity eSeries that the Columbus Collaboratory and Vernovus are partnering to offer to the community. So last week, Kevin led a really interesting discussion around cybersecurity planning and strategy. So today, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into one specific domain that Kevin touched on last week, and that's vulnerability management. So vulnerability management, as we know, is not the sexiest thing that we can do in cybersecurity, but it is necessary. It's necessary to do well. We know that if you do 2 things well in the cybersecurity space, you're going to be about 80 to 90% better than most of your peers, because these are the things that the threat actors are beating us with. One of them is vulnerability management, and the second is identity and access management. So, that's the reason why part 2 and 3 are focusing in vulnerability management and then identity access management. So without any further delay, here we go. Let's dive in, talk a little bit about the agenda today. So I'm going to do just a very, very quick recap on some of the domains that Kevin touched on last week. And then I'm going to start talking about the philosophy that the Collaboratory brings to cybersecurity. And we're going to dive into that by starting by explaining and laying out the playing field of threat actors and defenders and why threat-informed defense matters. And then we're going to talk about how we apply that threat-informed defense to vulnerability management. I'm going to explain a concept called the pyramid of pain. If you've never heard of this concept or you've never seen it, it might be something interesting and new for you to consider. And also what that teaches us about how to be strategic in planning our defenses. We're going to talk about some of the risks of random vulnerability management. That's really one of the philosophies that the Collaboratory brings to the table. Is we don't want our customers and we don't want the industry to continue to do security in a very random way. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and how it plays out. I'm going to introduce a new vernacular, I think, to the industry. We call it real operational risk. We'll explain what that means as opposed to theoretical risk and how we use real operational risk to drive prioritization in vulnerability management. And then ultimately we'll get into MITRE ATT&CK. So I'm assuming everybody is somewhat familiar with the concepts of MITRE ATT&CK and what MITRE is trying to bring to the table. We're going to take a pretty interesting approach, and we're going to talk about how we apply MITRE ATT&CK to vulnerability management. And that sort of application can really help you in your strategic planning of your vulnerability management program, as well as the security program as a whole. And then we'll talk about real operational risk again, as it applies to remediation and return on investment when you're dealing with executives. So I think we're going to touch on a little bit of everything in the vulnerability management space. So here we go. So last week, Kevin introduced or led a discussion around why strategic planning in your cybersecurity program is important. He touched on a number of different domains. You can see them up here on the screen. It's really interesting. When I first joined the Collaboratory almost 5 years ago now, one of the first things that we did, we had a very unique opportunity and relationship with our original 7 founding members we'll just go ahead and throw those out there for you so you understand what the relationship is. The collaboratory was formed by 7 of the largest companies here in the Columbus region. So organizations like AEP, or American Electric Power, Huntington National Bank, which is a large regional bank, L Brands, which most of you may recognize as, Pink, Bath and Body Works, Victoria's Secret brands, those sorts of things. Ohio Health, which is the largest hospital chain in the state of Ohio. Cardinal Health, which is, I believe, is a Fortune 18 company at this point. And if you have been listening to any of the COVID-19 task force discussions that are going on every day, you're probably going to recognize the name Cardinal Health. You're going to recognize the name Battelle as 2 Ohio companies that are really stepping up and creating testing and the ability to sanitize medical and PPE equipment. So Battelle is one of our members as well. And then Nationwide Insurance. So those organizations came together and said, listen, we're spending a lot of money in a couple of areas. And we think that if we pool our resources, if we create an organization like the Columbus Collaboratory that can work for us, can help us rapidly innovate in a couple of areas, we think that it's going to elevate the security posture of not only our organizations, but the Columbus region as a whole. So when we first got together, one of the very first things we did on the cyber side at the Collaboratory was we said, listen, if we could take security operations and look at it from a greenfield space where we were vendor agnostic and we wanted to think about and react to the threat actor, we want to be, automated, we want to leverage, artificial intelligence and automation and machine learning, what would we do differently? And we did a deep dive into 12 different security domains. 9 of them actually are on this screen, believe it or not. So we looked at things like perimeter protection, identity access management, vulnerability management, endpoint detection, security, or SIEMs, security event incident management, security orchestration and automation. So all of those different domains, we did a very, very deep dive as a collaborative group. So we pulled together the practitioners and the experts from our member companies, and we dove very deeply into each one of these areas because we were trying to figure out if there were ways that the Collaboratory could innovate in specific technologies or in specific domains. Vulnerability management was actually one of them. Vulnerability management has been around for a very long time. We all know that. But it's never easy to do. And the larger your environment gets, the harder it is. So we know that organizations spend a lot of money on their full Qualys implementations or Nessus Security Center or maybe Rapid7. But what comes with that is the human resources and the dollar spend that is necessary to drive those programs. And very rarely do we actually see risk being reduced from a vulnerability perspective from those vulnerability management programs. And we'll talk a little bit about why, and then we'll talk about how the Collaboratory, how our philosophy drives prioritization towards that remediation. So let's start out by talking about the playing field. And this philosophy really permeates everything we do at the Columbus Collaboratory. It starts with the threat actor. So there is a playing field that exists in the cybersecurity space. We have threat actors, they have plays. We know what some of those plays are. If we leverage frameworks and information like MITRE ATT&CK framework, we have a much better indication of what the threat actors are doing, how they are being successful, what their tendencies are. But what the industry is actually really, really bad at doing at this point is taking that information of what the threat actors do, how they do it, how they're successful, and how they're beating us, and actually applying it in a non-random way to our security program and our security controls. So once we understand that there's a playing field, if we can correlate this to a football game, I guess, what we want to understand is we want to know what their plays are. We want to know who the coaches are. We want to know who the players are, the different tendencies and capabilities of different players on those particular teams. It's no different in the threat intelligence space and understanding who these threat actors are and what they're doing. We know that threat actors have tendencies. We know that they are generally lazy. And what I mean by lazy is they will do the least amount of work to be successful. And unfortunately, that's really all that they still have to do today. So if I take this analogy of the playing field and of the football team, and if I'm Urban Meyer or I'm Ryan Day and I have Michigan's playbook in front of me, I have the ability to defend against the Desmond Howard so he's not able to, to run all over us and essentially win the Heisman, at Ohio Stadium. Instead, I can actually get to the quarterback because I understand the plays. I know what they're going to be doing. I can construct my defenses and my controls in that manner. So that's really the philosophy that the collaboratory tries to bring to the table. So let's drill down a little bit more into that playing field, and let's introduce you to a concept called the pyramid of pain. So this pyramid and this whole concept was created by a gentleman by the name, I think it was Joe Bianco. I don't know remember exactly which government agency he was with, but the premise of the pyramid of pain is the higher you move up in this pyramid in the threat intelligence space, the harder it is to do, but the detection value increases exponentially in your environment. So what he's saying and what we're trying to get across here is in the threat intelligence space and in the threat actor space, things like binaries, by hashes, IP addresses, and domain names, which we traditionally think of as threat intelligence, those things are very, very easy to detect in our environment, but they're also very easy for the threat actors to change. So they can actually change those domains and those IPs on the fly. They can just, create new binaries or flip a couple of bits, or maybe even get into polymorphic malware. Those sorts of things are very, very tough to detect when those changes happen, unless we have, extensive block lists and monitor lists. The point to the pyramid of pain is it's easy to detect those things, but the detection value is really minimal and they really have a shelf life. The higher we move up into understanding the types of tools that threat actors use and what we call TTPs, which is techniques, tactics, and procedures, which essentially are their tendencies, right? So if we think about the threat actor space the way that we think about a lot of other things, and you look at foreign nation state sponsored actors out of China, North Korea, Iran, Russia, those sorts of folks, if you actually look at the individuals and you get to know the types of individuals that make up those threat actor groups, you're going to find that a large majority of them are no different than most of the cybersecurity folks here in the US, okay? They were talented, they were working in some industry, or they went and, they were, in some military service or some government service, and their government identified that they are talented and they're good at what they do, and they approached them and they recruited them into these nation state sponsored threat actor capabilities. It's no different than what we do here. So the point of understanding the threat actor and understanding the TTPs and the tactics and the techniques and their tendencies and that whole thing is to understand that particular portions of a threat actor group may have come up from a networking background. Some of them may actually be very, very hands-on in the offensive work. They have teams that are developers. I mean, it's really no different than what we know here in the US. But understanding those tendencies and understanding the career paths of those threat actors and the types of things that they do on a regular basis, because they all do the same things over and over and over again. They use the same tools. They'll modify them over time. They'll recycle malware. They'll recycle infrastructure. They will sell infrastructure. They'll buy it. So, we know these things exist. So if we can actually understand how they're doing it and when they're doing it and why they're doing it, we can actually start to move from a very reactionary, tactical security program into one that is very strategic, so that we can start to create and construct our controls in a manner to defend against their techniques and their tactics, instead of trying to block and monitor where they're coming from. So we need to do both, okay? But we can't just do one or the other. So that's really the point of the pyramid of pain. The higher we move up on that pyramid, essentially the more mature our security programs and our security operations are, the higher detection value we're going to get. Okay. So Okay, so let's move on. Let's start diving into the vulnerability management piece of this, and we'll tie this all together as we move through here. So let's talk about some of the risks of random vulnerability management. So historically, most organizations, and this is changing slowly, most organizations, when they think about vulnerability management, they think about things like CVSS score, criticality. They track those things. They have metrics built on them. They've got SLAs designed around how fast or how quickly they're supposed to react to certain criticalities of CVEs that are being released. Well, generally the premise is the higher the CVSS score, so your 9s and your 10s, your criticals and your highs, the sooner we have to react. We have to run around with our hair on fire. We have to fix these criticals immediately, or our entire network's going to be owned. Well, the collaboratory's done some work in this data set. We look at the NVD database, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a huge repository. Essentially, it's where every vulnerability that's released is pushed into the NVD database. It's a way to track these things, but we can also mine that information for some pretty relevant, interesting data. So we know that, as of, this is probably about 2 months old, this particular data that's on here, but we know that there's about 130,000 CVEs that have been reported to the NVD database since the beginning. Here's the really, really interesting part, and it's going to flip that paradigm on its head. So of those 130,000 CVEs that have ever been pushed into the NVD database, only about 7.8% of them have ever actually been exploited, have ever actually been weaponized, meaning there's exploit code that's publicly available that someone can leverage in malware, in ransomware, in their tools, whether, in any of those capabilities that exist out there. Only about 7.8% of them. So the question that we should be asking ourselves is, are we focusing on prioritizing and remediating the right 7.8%? If I know that only 7.8% of them have been exploited, why am I prioritizing things that have not been weaponized, are not being researched by threat actors, they're not being leveraged in actual campaigns, when I know there's a smaller subset that are? And if those exist in my environment, I need to focus on those first. And we're going to talk here in a minute about how we determine what that information is and how to focus on it. Here's an even bigger
Troy.
statistic. Yes, sir.
I want to chime in for a second on this slide because I'm such a big fan of it. And not to offend anyone out there who may also be operating in the cybersecurity space, or if you're in the CIO space, but I'm willing to go out on a limb and say pretty much no one generally across the information security or information management space knows these statistics.
Yep.
And it's a shame. A lot of people will look at this kind of information about CVEs and about what the NVD database holds and mistakenly think, okay, this is tactical, this is just technical. This is a strategic planning slide, and it is really, really important. The idea that most people in our space don't know that 1% of exploited CVEs are these 9s and 10s. And that is a tremendously important piece of information. And as Troy mentioned, we create policy and process around what those CVE ratings are to determine what the reaction speed time needs to be, what the operational framework needs to look like for how our teams address these vulnerabilities. And yet, if it's not being done with insight into what actually matters the most, into what the target space really is for the attackers, your strategy may be based on, as Troy said, a random approach. Yeah. It's not as simple as looking at what the CVS numbers are. The fact that most people don't know this, even in our space, is a powerful and strategic piece of information.
No, I agree. It's incredibly shocking. I had not seen, I've been doing this for 20 some years. I had not seen this information until we started diving into it a couple of years ago. And this has the potential to lead to all kinds of very, very interesting predictive weaponization stuff. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through here. But Kevin, you hit it right on the money. The reality is most security organizations, when a CVSS 10, a critical, or even a 9 hits their environment or hits the news, right? We know that the first thing that's going to happen is the CEO is going to ask the CIO, and the CIO is going to ask the CISO, are we protected from this brand new, hair on fire CVSS 10 vulnerability? And the answer is likely going to be no. So then we're going to spend all weekend or potentially all week running around identifying and patching these things. But do we need to, right? Because if it's not being weaponized, it's not being researched, obviously there's the potential for zero-day code to exist. Fair, okay? And we can react to these sorts of things as we see fit. But as a security program, we should not be building our strategy around reacting and chasing the latest, bouncing ball that goes across our desk. And that's really, I think, what we've been doing for a very long time in constructing our security programs to react to these 9s and 10s, when these are not what the threat actors are actually weaponizing. What they're weaponizing are the 4s, 5s, and 6s, and we're going to show you that here in just a minute, that can be chained together to do a series of things. It's not the 9s and 10s, though we do see some of those.
Hey, Troy.
Yes, ma'am.
For us non-technical people, someone just reminded that not everyone knows what these initials stand for. Could you cover those just really quickly?
Yeah, so CVE stands for Common Vulnerability Enumeration. So it is the syntax, it's the system that vulnerabilities are reported out to the industry. So the NVD database means National Vulnerability Database. I believe today it's controlled by an organization called MITRE. And essentially it's just a huge repository of all the vulnerabilities that have ever been released. CVSS is a ranking or rating system given to vulnerabilities. So that goes from 0 all the way up to 10. And theoretically, CVSS 10s are supposed to be the most critical, supposed to give the threat actor the most capability to compromise or to exploit that vulnerability. And they do. I understand where CVSS scores come from. It comes from attributes and the capabilities and the types of access you can gain if you're able to actually exploit and weaponize against these vulnerabilities. The premise here, though, is that because it's the most critical and it's the most dangerous at the level 10, we should be reacting to those quickest. Well, the problem is that that's not what threat actors are in the biggest sense. That's not what they're focusing their effort on. So CVSS is just a ranking or a rating system for CVEs. You may also hear throughout this conversation something called CWE, which is Common Weakness Enumeration. So if you think of like the OWASP top 10, those are CWEs. So a weakness in software is where CVEs are able to take advantage of software. So CWEs, there's a list of different types of weaknesses, like the ability to do, an injection or, any of those number of things. And where those weaknesses exist is where CVEs kind of fit into each one of those CWEs. So if we hear CWE later, that's the explanation. And they actually map well together, and we'll show you how we're leveraging those mappings. Does that help, Petra?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how the collaboratory and how our ISAL, which is an information sharing and analysis organization, how we think about and how we leverage this type of information. So what I've got up here on the screen is one of the things that we do is we track real threat intelligence information, whether it's primary source intelligence from some of our vendors, whether it's primary source intelligence from us that we're gathering, whether it's the loads and loads of articles that are available every single day. And some of the folks on my team, they are specifically assigned to understanding vulnerability intelligence. So we're actually doing research on what threat actors are researching and weaponizing today. We want to know what they're working on today. Okay, we don't really care what they were working on 6 months ago. We don't really care about the vulnerabilities that were released 4 or 5 months ago. We want to understand the chatter. We want to understand what we're seeing being bought and sold in the marketplaces. We want to understand what they're actually weaponizing today. So one of the feeds that I bring in on a daily basis is one from Recorded Future. And it's actually a free feed. Everybody is capable of going out and registering for it. One of the pieces of information that they supply is they've got sensors all over the world, and those sensors are kicking back information about the types of CVEs that are actually being exploited in the wild. So what you're looking at here, this actually is this week's data. I think it's a combination of Friday and Monday's information or data that I brought in just from Recorded Future. If you look at the CVE, the dates, and if you look at the CVSS scores over here, sure, some of them are high, but if I'm focusing my program around fixing the criticals, the 9s and the 10s, I will only have hit one of these vulnerabilities in here, okay? Does anybody remember CVE 2017-0147? Probably not. If I told you it was part of WannaCry, which was one of the most destructive ransomware campaigns we've seen in a very long time, well, I think it was be 3 years this coming May. Actually, it may be this month. In 2017 is when WannaCry hit. This CVE 2017-0147 is still the most exploited vulnerability in the wild today, okay? And it's been around for more than 3 years, and the criticality auditor CVSS score is a medium. Most organizations would never get to a point where they're patching this medium because they're focusing so much time on the criticals and the highs. So if we look at things like, I don't know, the CVE 2019-15-126, that is a low. No one's ever going to touch that. But if you think about the current situation where we're at today, where everybody is working from home today, where is the major threat to your environment? Is it your internal network today, or is it the remote users? Is it the remote workers at this point? That information disclosure on Broadcom Wi-Fi client devices, that's a vulnerability that could allow an attacker to essentially crack the WPA and get it hop onto that Wi-Fi network. So these sorts of things are actually, just because it's an information disclosure vulnerability and it's a low, most organizations are never going to get it. But this is actually being weaponized today. And I want to prioritize fixing that before I prioritize anything else that I know is not being worked on by the threat actor space. Hold on a second, I lost my screen. There we go. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to loop Kevin back into the conversation. I wanted to ask him before we dive into this slide, and I wanted to ask him if, is his experience and his role as a CIO, as at the executive level, if he could talk to us a little bit about his experiences and how vulnerability management relates to risk and how that risk is traditionally communicated to executives and in board level discussions. And we'll explain why this is an important question.
Yeah, definitely. Happy to chime in on that. The problem is that when you talk about risk management and look at risk management within the realm of cybersecurity, it far too often is not communicated to executives and to board members above the executive level. And far too often, when those attempts are made to communicate what risk management, what the intersection of risk management and cybersecurity risk really is, it's far too often not done in a language and in a style that non-technical people can appreciate and that they can absorb, that leadership can manage in a strategic way as opposed to a tactical or a random way. Too often, the approach is very technical, very much in the weeds, or maybe brought up a little bit from the very lowest levels, but still might not be at the right level for absorption and to be actually used and employed as a strategic tool for board members and by strategic decision makers at the heads of the enterprise.
Yeah.
So this is why one of the best tools to help make that transition to understanding how enterprise risk, IT risk, and cybersecurity risk all play together, and then to make the case for how a specific risk area that is so foundational, like vulnerability management, plays into all of that risk. This is why we leverage frameworks. This is the power of frameworks and models which I mentioned last week a few times in our seminar. These are those frameworks, these cybersecurity frameworks and structures. They allow the translation. They allow a common language to be created that can be used to take critical topics like this and make them more understandable for strategic level absorption. Yeah. And I want to just give a direct example that ties into what you're talking about, Troy, here. One of the most common in the United States is the NIST cybersecurity framework. It's extremely popular. The only other competitor it really has in terms of usage would be the ISO standards, which are a little more international in flavor and also a little older, have been updated a little less recently. In the NIST cybersecurity framework, all of the realms of cybersecurity operations are broken down into 5 categories: identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. So you can take almost all of the arenas within the domains of cybersecurity and break them up into those 5 basically operational activities, the things that need to be done, and all of those will align. All of those areas will align somewhere within identify, detect, protect, respond, or recover. Here's what's so interesting. If you look into the definitions that NIST provides of those 5 operational activities, vulnerability management is integrated so strongly throughout the cybersecurity framework that NIST provides that honestly, if you're not familiar with it, you'd be surprised. Yep. Especially within the first 3 key pieces of those 5 operational activities. Identify, which is all about identifying risk and identifying threats and identifying the nature of your enterprise's information infrastructure and mapping those together. And then again, when it comes to detect and protect, protecting everything that was identified and protecting against threats, risk management is the terminology that the NIST framework uses to describe what vulnerability management is for and what threat intelligence is for. It's all presented in the cybersecurity framework in terms of risk management. So it's a natural fit, if you're aware of it, to talk in terms of risk management and business risk management to strategic leaders, to those board members and to those executives, because the mapping is already there. It's built in to these frameworks, which makes them just a wonderful tool that far too often isn't taken advantage of by CISOs and by CIOs who are trying to make the case. But it really is integrated. Vulnerability management is integrated right within the big picture risk management structure that these frameworks define. Yep. So it's unfortunately often not made. The case is too often not presented, but it can be made, and it can be made in a very strategic way by looking at all of this arena. Even a technical connected arena like vulnerability management can be linked directly to how your enterprise risk and your business risk and then your tech and information security risks are managed.
Yeah, I can completely agree with that. I think that's fantastic. That's a fantastic statement. I absolutely agree. So what I wanted to bring to light here, and I wanted to bring to the table is cyber risk should be, and in a lot of organizations it is, a board level topic, right? So I don't want to talk necessarily about theoretical risk. And by theoretical risk, I'm talking about, dollar values based on vulnerabilities. And if this happens, and how does it really truly affect my business? I'm going to start talking about a concept that I think we coined called real operational risk. Okay. And what real operational risk does is it helps us figure out what to prioritize working on in our environment. So the way that real operational risk works is we understand the vulnerability state. So we've got our vulnerability scanning infrastructure where we're identifying, whether it's Qualys, Rapid7, Nessus, whatever the case may be, we're identifying where the vulnerabilities exist. Now, most organizations, when they think of vulnerability management and vulnerability scanning, they think of what I call network vulnerability scanning. Most organizations are not putting the right emphasis on web application vulnerability scanning. We know that web applications are a prime target, right? But what becomes very, very difficult to do is to take network vulnerability data and marry it up with web application vulnerability data so that you can talk about your vulnerability state from a holistic perspective. So what I mean by that is, if I've got I don't know, an e-commerce platform, right? That's fine. E-commerce platforms out there, it's, you know, selling things, and that's where most of our revenue as an organization might come from. When I think about web application vulnerabilities, and I think about network or server side vulnerabilities, very rarely do I see organizations able to communicate or articulate how network or server side vulnerabilities could impact that web application. And more importantly, I may have an e-commerce application that's out there. It looks like a big beast of a thing, but what's actually happening is underneath that web application could be 10, 12, 15, 20, 50 different virtual machines, different, you know, bare metal. It could be all kinds of different IP addresses and things communicating with each other outside or underneath of that actual web application. Unless I can communicate the vulnerability state of that entire system in a coherent way, I'm not really going to be able to understand the real risk to my business. So what the Collaboratory has done, and with the platform that we've built that we call VMS, Vulnerability Management Solution, is we're bringing this concept of understanding the vulnerabilities in my environment, understanding the real world threat intelligence that tells me that there's a threat actor doing something with this, they're researching it, there's an exploit available that could be, you know, operationalized in a matter of minutes. And the most important piece of this real operational risk is understanding your assets and their criticality to your business. In my 22 years of doing this, I have never seen a complete functional asset database or CMDB. Kevin, have you? Anywhere? Never. So
No.
The reason why this is important is, let's say, for instance, we're going to break it down to just the basics. If I've got two machines in my environment, one's responsible for handling payroll, the other's responsible for ordering coffee. Which one of those machines am I going to prioritize remediation first, right? If I have limited resources, I need to know which one I focus on in the event that I have to pick one. That's the type of asset criticality and understanding of my environment, my assets, that is incredibly important to understanding how to prioritize what I'm going to remediate first. So in the example of the payroll machine and the coffee machine, most folks would tell you that I'd focus on the coffee machine first, right? Because you got to have your coffee. Seriously, folks would say we need to remediate the payroll system first. However, what if there's an attack path from that compromised coffee machine that could get an attacker to give them the ability to elevate permissions, move laterally into domain admin from that coffee machine that doesn't exist from the payroll machine? I need to understand that context so I can truly understand how to prioritize what to work on and what's important to work on that particular machine. So if we bring those three pieces of information together, the vulnerability state, the threat intelligence that says that a threat actor is working on this, and it's on a critical machine, where those intersect is what we call real operational risk. So where those three pieces of information come together, I want to focus on those first. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to do anything else after that, but that's where I want to focus my effort. At this point, a lot of organizations will tell you, well, we're 100% patch. We patch all the things every time. The reality is that's not true. They don't. When they say 100% patch, what they're saying is we probably patch CVSS score 7s and 10s all the time, and we'll get to the 6s and below as we can. But as we already have shown, the 6s and below are where we're actually going to end up getting beaten because we're focusing on the 7s and 10s. So where all that information intersects is what we call real operational risk. And this prioritization can really help us drive down risk reduction, or drive risk reduction from here. I lost my screen. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we do this at the Collaboratory. So what I'm showing you here is an administration page from our VMS platform. And essentially, I'm going to show you how kind of mathematically and under the covers, we are creating this real operational risk model. So part of what we do for the VMS service, it is a managed service. There is a delivery platform. But the technology that underlies the VMS platform, what we're really doing underneath the covers here is essentially we are doing the real operational risk Venn diagram, in the platform. So essentially we do discover the vulnerabilities, we do report them, but the threat intelligence piece of it really is the most important in the asset management, the understanding the criticality of those assets. And then we also want to understand things like the perspective of the machines. If I've got a machine that sits on the perimeter versus the machine that sits on the internal network, should those be weighted a little differently? The most important and valuable piece of this VTR, which means vulnerability, threat, rank, those three pieces of the Venn diagram, the most valuable piece of this information is the asset rank, right? So essentially we run an algorithm. Every time we see a vulnerability, we'll check it against our threat intel feeds. We'll see if there's current threat intelligence that says somebody's doing something with this. My team pushes intel, pushes CVEs into this system every single day from our threat intelligence research, our vulnerability intelligence research. And once one of those CVEs hits the VMS system, it'll stay there for 30 days, right? Because we really want this VTR algorithm to be very timely. We want it to be telling us this is important today, do something with it now, okay? If a CVE would get sent back into the algorithm within that 30-day window, the timer starts over for that particular CVE. We also understand concepts like I may have, as an organization, I may have certain signatures or certain things that I know are important that I also want to be added to the weights, which is where we get things like this ability to do flaggable mappings. So for instance, if you think about a perimeter network and an internal network, right, the existence of SMB is not a bad thing on the internal network. In fact, it's absolutely required. The existence of SMB being open on the perimeter is a horrible idea. If you were to look at vulnerability scan data, just in an Excel spreadsheet or even in most of the platforms that exist, the mere existence of an open SMB port is not a vulnerability. You have to understand the perspective. So in the VTR weighting and how we think about real operational risk, if I know that an asset is actually tagged as external and an SMB port happens to open up or shows up in one of my scans, I want that to be, I want to be alerted to that immediately. And I also want to add that to the algorithm that's doing the scoring, that's helping me prioritize what to work on, okay? Another important piece of this is also where we start to bring in the MITRE attack framework into our vulnerability management program. So we actually have but we're well on down the path of reading in everything that MITRE attack has to offer. So for instance, we will customize an instance of VMS to the particular company that we're dealing with. We'll figure out which industry they operate in, and then from there, MITRE actually takes us down and helps us understand the types of threat actors and techniques that someone that operates, say for instance, in the government industry or in the healthcare industry, that they should be interested in. And then we can actually map that all the way to MITRE techniques and add that stuff to the vulnerability scores. We'll show you here in just a minute what that actually looks like in practice. So just wanted to show you, so these are the ways that we're actually operationalizing this VTR score and this real operational risk. And the way that it presents itself is through a prioritization score for every asset. And then we want to focus on the top 10, 20 of those every single day. That's your list of things to go and patch every day, is the top of that prioritization, that VTR score. Okay, so let's switch gears here and let's talk a little bit more about the threat actor side of this. So what you guys are looking at here, this is what we call a threat profile that is created based on the MITRE attack framework for a particular industry. We do this with every one of the customers that we engage. If you join our ISAL, which is a threat intel sharing group, it's kind of a horizontal intel sharing group as opposed to a vertical like you would think from an ISAC, like FS ISAC or the healthcare ISAC. our ISAL, we interact with organizations from all kinds of different industries. And the first thing we want to do is we want them to start thinking about who are the types of threat actors that I need to be concerned about that are interested in my data and interested in me as a target. So this is an example of a financial services threat profile. So what we're doing here is we are looking at the maturity and capabilities in the vertical axis, and we're looking at the interest in a particular industry there in the horizontal axis, right? So essentially what we're doing is we're taking that universe of threat actors that exist out there, and we're reducing it down to a manageable set of capable, mature threat actors that are interested in me as an industry. And essentially that's where the top right quadrant of the heat map brings us. So we take that huge list and we reduce it down to a much smaller group. From here, this is where we start to pull in and apply the MITRE ATT&CK framework, okay? So what that heat map and that threat profile would actually end up looking like in practice is something like this spreadsheet. So what you're looking at here is not the financial services threat profile. I've actually gone out last week and I did a COVID-19 threat profile. This is a list of threat actors that are currently targeting COVID-19 as campaigns, meaning they're doing spear phishing, all kinds of phishing. They're actually doing direct attacks, but they're under the auspices of COVID-19. So the way that this works is we have the ability to take these threat actors, we've modeled them, we know who they are, we understand the techniques that they bring to bear and that they're known to leverage, and then we can actually chart these techniques. And what we're looking at here, this can be applied to all different aspects of your cybersecurity program. So for instance, let's say I want to do a controls gap analysis based on this threat profile. If I know who my threat actors are and I know the techniques that they're known to leverage, what I would do if I look at this particular matrix is the first thing I'm going to say is, okay, what controls do I have in place to deal with, say, drive-by compromise? What technical controls, what program controls, what humans do I have in place? What resources do I have? Do I have vendors that can that can help me address some of these things? Same thing would go with execution through API, binary padding, code signing, all of those different techniques that map directly to these threat actors. The interesting thing is you can actually do the same thing with vulnerability management. And here's how it looks and how it works. So in the VMS platform, we've actually pulled this matrix into the platform, and we're able to map the existence of CVEs and CWEs. Remember, we talked about those earlier, to MITRE techniques. And the way that we present this to our customers is we say, listen, you've got a vulnerability in your environment that maps to, say, brute force. So if you're interested in if I've got weaknesses or vulnerabilities in my network that could likely be exploited by brute force attacks, what are they and who are they, right? So this is a way to help us prioritize what to work on. Essentially, what you're looking at here is your vulnerability state as it applies to MITRE ATT&CK. These are the techniques that I need to focus on. It's a way for me to prioritize. Let's go a little bit deeper. What we've also done is we've taken that exact same matrix that I just showed you of the red and white matrix, and we've essentially pulled in the ability to select threat actors right here in the matrix. And then we can overlay that threat profile right onto your vulnerability data. So what you're looking at here is where you have a box that's outlined in red. That is coming from the threat profile matrix we showed you, the red and white spreadsheet, overlaid onto this matrix. Where you see a solid red box, you've got a threat actor in my profile that leverages that technique on a regular basis, and I have a vulnerability in my environment that could be exploited that way. So I need to prioritize the things in those red boxes first in my environment. If I'm looking at this from a MITRE ATT&CK perspective, the really interesting thing about this is the VTR score that we're doing for prioritization. These mappings are actually part of that score as well. So you're getting this in the prioritization score, but this is a visual way that you can present this for instance, into the executive team. Here are my threats. Here's the threat profile. These are the threat actors that I need to be interested in. And these are the types of vulnerabilities that exist in my environment. What are the controls I have, and how do I remediate them first, right? So I would focus on these red boxes first. Okay. So let's dig a little bit deeper. So the account discovery, I decide that's something that I want to look at because it's threat actors is leveraging it, and the vulnerabilities exist in my environment. And essentially, I would get a list of those vulnerabilities and the systems that are affected by them. And this is my action item for today if I want to address the account discovery vulnerability. So we've gone from very strategic to how we think about prioritization to a very tactical prioritized list of things to go and do. And we've done it from understanding the real operational risk, understanding who the threat actors are, and then understanding my threat profile and my threat tolerance, quite honestly, or my risk tolerance. Okay, so we're at the point now that we've understood what needs to be prioritized, what to work on. We understand the concepts of real operational risk. So how do I communicate this to the board, right? Well, we need to be able to start tracking metrics and start tracking, are we getting better or are we getting worse? Are we actually getting the return on investment for this service or this technology? Meaning, are we driving down risk based on the work that we're doing here? We need to have a way to calculate this. Traditionally, most organizations, they track very basic metrics about vulnerability management. What are the CVSS scores? How many are there? How many systems are affected? And that's what they're reporting. Well, but that's not really telling you if you're reducing your risk. If we know that real operational risk says that I can have a low or medium CVSS score vulnerability in my environment on a critical machine, and threat intelligence says someone's doing something with that, the risk there is much higher than if I'm missing one of those three pieces. So I need to be able to track, and I need to be able to communicate how I'm driving down that real operational risk. And then this can ultimately play into your theoretical risk and your business risk and those sorts of things. So this is a moving target, but what we're really trying to do here is we want to be able to compare from one scan to the next how my asset scores, my prioritization scores are reducing across the entire program. In this particular example, they only were able to drop their real operational risk score by 2 points, which isn't very good, which means they didn't actually hit the right things that they should have been hitting. If they were remediating the things that were actually prioritized for them, this score would have dropped exponentially more than it did, and they actually would have lowered the risk quite a bit, reduced the risk. So here, this is where I want to pull Kevin back in here because this is kind of the area that he lives in, is communicating risk and ROI and those sorts of things. So Kevin, what sorts of difficulties currently exist that you see in communicating risk reduction to executive leadership, right? And how are those discussions usually framed as they pertain to ROI and technology, resource spend, and those sorts of topics?
Yes, I'll be brief since we're getting close to the end, but it's a wonderful topic. I love nothing more than when someone, a CIO or a business leader, asks me, so what is the ROI? Is there any way to really produce and show the value in terms of return on investment, and maybe even in dollars and cents, to having a cybersecurity program and having advanced tools, processes, and training and all these other items in place? For example, like this view of true ROR when it comes to vulnerability management, because the ROI of all of these items is so dramatically positive across the board that I just smile, because I know that I'm going to be able to tell a really, really good and well-documented story about the value of these types of investments. Yeah. Far too often that case is not made, and that's something that is unfortunate, because it is not difficult at all with standardized and standards-based approaches to looking at quantifiable ROI. It is not hard to make an extremely positive case for what some might consider to be, some significant investment into your cybersecurity. but versus the risk, versus the potential losses, versus the hazards that are out there, ROI is enormous and enormously positive. That case needs to be made more often. And I enjoy that particular question when someone says, can you help us show the value of our cyber spend to the board? It just brings nothing but a smile to my face, because yes, I can. And tools like this are dramatically powerful in helping reduce risk and reduce dramatic potential losses that the cybersecurity, information security world now has at stake, at risk for enterprises.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great answer. I appreciate that. Okay, so I know that I went a little bit long. I can get wordy. I apologize. We got about a minute or two for any questions. Petra, you want to take or Ben?
Sure, yeah. So we do have a couple questions. First one, you seem to know the threat actors by name or group. Do you also know their physical locations as well?
Some of them, it depends. So we have a much better idea of where they operate virtually. So let's be clear, the Collaboratory is not a primary source intelligence organization. We do rely on partners for a lot of the intel that we bring to bear here. Folks like Recorded Future, Intel 471, folks like TrueStar, which is a threat intel platform. We bring all of these technologies and capabilities together. One of the most important trainings I ever got was about 3 years ago. We brought in a gentleman by the name of Jeff Barton, who runs a group called Treadstone 71. Jeff is a former career CIA, human intelligence, real intel, gathering guy. And he was able to take their methodologies to intel gathering and apply it to cybersecurity. And he really revolutionized the way that we think about threat intelligence in the space. I would suggest, if you are interested in threat intelligence, you need to change the way you think about intelligence. It's not indicators of compromise. That is not intelligence. Intelligence is understanding the adversary, right? It's not understanding particularly where they're coming from. So some of these folks, we know where they are. Some of them, we know where they operate. We know which forums they operate in and which marketplaces they own and sell and that sort of stuff. But I mean, you'd have to get into, the FBI, the three-letter agencies to truly understand, what they're wearing today and where they're traveling, that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. So we'll just ask one more and then I'll give it to Jason to close. So if tracking and reacting to CVSS scores for prioritization appears to be obsolete, what other technologies exist or are being developed to help us predict things like weaponization likelihood that can get us closer to predicting where threats will materialize?
Kevin, do you want to jump or you want me to take this?
Yeah, you can go ahead and take that.
Okay. So, I mean, this is actually an area that we're working on, right? And I mean, there's a lot of attributes to CVSS that we can compare, we can mine, we can use machine learning and AI models to help us try to predict, where we're going. Let me see if I can actually pull up a screen. I don't know if I can. It's not going to let me. Never mind. Anyway, so one of the things that we're doing, so part of the Collaboratory is data science. So we've got an entire team of data scientists, mathematicians, statisticians that this is what they do every day. They operate in all kinds of different domains, but a lot of times they cross over into the cyberspace. One of the projects that we currently have them working on now is looking at the CVSS attack vectors. So if you ever look at the details of a CVE, you're going to see this vector thing that's got a bunch of weird letters. So we can start to compare weaponized CVEs to non-weaponized CVEs, and then we can compare attributes of those attack vectors and on a large scale, and then we can actually predict based on those attributes of a weaponized CVE the likelihood that something similar to it could be or will be weaponized in the future. So we actually have some of those models in operation in VMS. I'm not able to pull it up right now and show you, but yeah. So there's a lot of organizations that are working in this space, but it is in machine learning. It is a big data problem that folks are focusing on.
Great, thank you. So we're a little bit over time. We will follow up with you individually for the rest of the questions we have left. So I'll go ahead and pass things over to Jason to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Petra. Troy and Kevin, thank you both for the knowledge and expertise. As always, you guys continue to prove to us just how deep you can go on these topics. So thank you on behalf of everybody. And thanks to our audience today for listening in. As Petra mentioned, my name is Jason Skidmore. I'm with Vernovus. We're very pleased and excited about the partnership and this series that we're doing with the Columbus Collaboratory. And I would invite everybody back next week, April 23rd. We will be hosting our third in this three-part series, which will be, our topic will be identity access management. So we look forward to jumping on that and getting a little bit deeper. And of course, I'll also throw out, if you are finding these valuable and there are topics that we are not covering that you have an interest in, please reach out to us. Let us know. You can reach out directly to myself, Petra, or anybody here from the call, and we'd be happy to consider future topics of interest and begin to queue those up. So anyway, with that, I'll again thank everybody for being here. Have a great day. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.